Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Public History with Jake and Justin. I'm Jake Wynn. It's been a wild year of political turmoil in the United States as the nation moves headlong towards a presidential election in November 2024. Between failed assassination attempts, President Biden dropping out of the race, and everything in between, this has been one of the most historic years in American history, and it's only July. In this week's episode, we are chatting with historian Evan Kutzler about what happens when public history and politics collide. Before we jump into our interview with Evan, though, Justin, how are you doing? Certainly been a long time.
It has been a minute, and also I loved your serious and it's only July voice there. That was good. You need to narrate more, Jake, as we continue it. But no, it's been good. Summer's been going well, and just excited that it's finally cooling down.
Yep, we have this brief little window of some cooler weather. I hate to say it, Justin, but looking at the 10-day...
Don't tell me that. Don't tell me.
I'm seeing more 95, 96, 97 in our future. So, yeah, it's going to be a good time to get out to the pool.
Right, yeah. Very good for a full day, and I'm sure there's people, if they listen to us out in Arizona, that are saying, what, it's 1:15, how can you say that? Listen, we get it. I understand. I'm sorry that you have to live in a place like that. It's beautiful, by the way. I don't want to disparage Arizona.
Yep. It's a dry heat. It's dry heat, yeah. We have humidity here, so it's 100 and humid. It's terrible. The worst of all worlds. All right, so without further ado, let's jump into my conversation with Evan Kutzler. All right, everyone. So I am here with Dr. Evan Kutzler, who is an author and historian who currently serves as an associate professor of history at Western Michigan University. As Evan himself describes his career, he is a Tennessean by birth, an academic by training, and a public historian by instinct. So someone perfect for the Public History podcast to talk about this topic today. Today we're going to be chatting with Evan about the role of historians and public historians in the mad rush of political events and turmoil that we've all been experiencing over the last decade. Evan, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for inviting me on the show.
Excellent. We are delighted to have you. So as we dive in, just wanted to provide you a little opportunity just to kind of introduce yourself to the audience, a little bit about your background and your own role as a public historian.
Sure. So I go way back. I go back to 2002 as a public historian. My first job, weekends and summers, was as a docent at the Carter House Museum in Franklin, Tennessee. I went to college and by default studied history and learned that everything I thought about what I was doing with history seemed to be wrong, or at least not fit in well to academic history. I learned what the word public history was in graduate school en route to a PhD, and I thought, well, actually, this is closer to what I was doing when I first fell in love with history. So I picked up a master's in public history en route to the PhD. My first job after finishing the PhD was the seasonal park ranger at Andersonville National Historic Site. And, I don't know how 2015 was for you in the job market, but I sometimes joke that I took the easy way out and instead of landing in a career in public history, I just found a tenure track job teaching public history. So as a professor in Southwest Georgia, as I was working on books, I was also beginning to sort of turn local and think about how, as a historian, I could put myself into the community, answer questions about the town's past, and kind of connect past and present place to history, to ideas. And that's been my approach to history over the last 8 years or so. So now I'm in Michigan, taking on a new role, but still working in U.S. and public history.
Excellent. Yeah, it's funny you bring up 2015. It's actually a topic that Justin and I talk quite a bit about, kind of offline, because Justin and I both, it's the summer we met. It's my first summer, my only summer working with the National Park Service. I was an intern at Fredericksburg in Spotsylvania National Military Park, and this topic, 2015, comes up often as like kind of the life-altering experience in public history for almost all of us that were there at the park that summer because of the events that took place, in South Carolina, and how it almost instantaneously changed the conversation about the Civil War at the historic sites where we were working, in addition to everywhere in the country. And so it was kind of a very eye-opening experience for all of us, just kind of starting our career in public history.
Sure, yeah, it was a difficult summer, and I felt heartbroken leaving South Carolina, leaving graduate school, and not feeling like I was able to participate in this giant conversation, and going to an institution that is pretty closed-lipped on big national issues. But it was certainly a learning lesson in public history in the 21st.
Yeah, I think that's a great kind of transition piece, because I think 2015 is actually a kind of great place of where this conversation really starts, with the events of that summer, whether it's from the massacre in Charleston to the political campaign that kicked off in the summer of 2015, going into the 2016 election. And so what we're going to discuss today is kind of, this topic came out of a Slate.com article by author and public historian William Hoagland, an essay that he kind of takes on the concept of this, I'll air quotes this for the listeners, resistance historian, a phenomenon. Of course, there's a number of different names for this variety of historian, public historian, that really exploded online, especially during the presidency of Donald Trump, where a number of historians online, especially in the Twitter space, gained a massive following online and out in the real world, making appearances on cable news, commentating on current events through the lens of history. This gets to a topic, this article kind of came up, at a time where I've been thinking a lot about these kind of conversations, and amongst my friend group of public historians talking a lot about this sort of thing. And I have to admit that myself, definitely aspired to fall into that category, I think, a little bit back in the mid 20-teens, to trying to, say the right thing, make the right tweet that got noticed and went viral, and never really succeeded at that. So this is something I've been very familiar with for many years. And I think now, as we look back on it, almost on a different era of history online and the way we have conversations online about history, I think that this hit quite interesting to me. And I'm curious, Evan, what, how this article and this conversation, and this thought process of kind of looking back at this era of history online, what you thought about Hoagland's article and really about this conversation.
So first, a little bit about William Hoagland, because in this world where anybody can say anything online, credentials both don't matter and very much do matter. And so Hoagland's he's a solid independent scholar of the American Revolution. He's not trained as a historian specifically, and yet, right, he's a prolific writer in book and public-facing articles. His scholarship gets discussed alongside scholars like Woody Colton. And this article for Slate is a continuation of the criticism, the uses of history and popular and political culture, going back through Alexander Hamilton to the 1619 Project, right, to never-ending predictions about the end of our republic, and happy conversations like that. And his argument in brief is that academic historians, he mentions Heathercock Richardson, Kevin Croon, Timothy Snyder by name in this article, are kind of rushing for this mic drop historian era moment that's going to use the past to solve our immediate problems. And in the process, he argues, and he does this not just in this article, he does this again and again throughout his articles over the years, is that historians are contorting complicated history. They're overemphasizing maybe their expertise in areas that are outside of their narrowly defined field, and sometimes they just make it up. And I'm personally pretty sympathetic to these concerns. I did think, as I thought he focused a little too heavily on Heather Cox Richardson, though. She's been incredibly successful in the genre, and yeah, I'm admittedly I'm not totally sold. I'm not sold on how the South won the Civil War, that all of our problems can just be traced back to the Confederacy or the old South. In some ways, I wish they could, because that might be maybe easier to solve. But I don't know if that makes me an optimist or a pessimist here. But Hoagland's broader caution that I share is that if we want a usable past to understand the present, and that's where he actually, I think, does want us historians in conversation with the present. But his concern is, my concern is, I think, that bad history is by definition not a usable past, at least not a usable past for a more peaceful future.
Yeah, I think that's a concern that I've increasingly come to have as well. And I think that the central thesis that Hoagland is working on in this article, and like you said, kind of in his other writings on this topic, as well as he also has a Substack as well, where he covers this topic. I do, as I think you do as well. We'll get into this in just a second. I think he latched on potentially to the wrong person in this kind of context, and so you draw a distinction between the writings of Heather Cox Richardson. I know you've mentioned some things you may not agree with in her book, How the South Won the Civil War, but she has an extremely popular Substack. This is actually a topic that comes up pretty regularly amongst even folks that are not in the historical community, that are regular readers of that Substack that she writes. But you draw a distinction between her and some other historians, especially on Twitter, who kind of ride the line between historical analysis and political punditry. Could you speak a little bit more to that distinction?
Sure. So, Richardson's project makes a lot of sense as a dedicated writing project. I'm amazed it's gone on for as long as it's gone on, right? Letters from an American, right? Which is a throwback to 1782 Letters from an American Farmer. And it's interesting that, right, she cuts out, she doesn't say American historian in the title, just from an American, right? She's meditating on democracy. Her standpoint is very clear in the description of what she's doing. But, I first realized how big this Substack was. It's now up to like 1.5 million people or some crazy number like that. When a friend from an acquaintance from high school reached out to me on Facebook and said, "Hey, is this person legit? Because I really like what she's saying about the past." And I said, like, yeah, she is. Like, let me give you the reading list of the Death of Reconstruction. Let me give you some. And she's no. I'm reading this Substack she's doing, and I wasn't as familiar with how big this had got, how fast it had gotten. And she has every right to do this. And if someone was going to do it, I would rather it be a historian. And this is, this is a role of a historian, right? We have, historians maybe have a credentialing problem of there's no license to practice it. On the other hand, there's no real license to practice political punditry either. And so I think that if a historian is going to be making day-to-day connections and insight and be writing at that pace, I'd rather be a historian. On the other hand, that means people are going to make mistakes. Richardson inspired me not to start a blog or a newsletter, but to write one article a month for the local newspaper, not connecting in this very explicit way between the past and one political party or another, but just to dive down into local topics or local people and meditate on those events in the local and national past. I think Hoagland focuses on one especially bad moment, right? The saying that if Biden drops out, the weight of history shows that Democrats will lose. This is a bad moment it's a perfect example of what he sees as the resistance historians or really just the punditry of historians, or that historians can fall into. I think my bigger concern, and this takes us back to Twitter, is for the tendency of historians who enter this gray zone between historical analysis and punditry to, once you put an idea out there, to then, whether it's good or bad, to defend it with such a degree of certainty and and almost closed-mindedness that you would never see at a conference among colleagues, or I think in an exchange at a museum or a library. There's something very performative about it, and I don't think it's good for discourse at all. It's just often downright mean and unbecoming of historians, and I don't think Richardson falls into that category. I mean, I think that's that. In fact, I'm confident she doesn't. But there are plenty of historians who are falling into that, have fallen into that, and it can at times it can ruin careers by people overreach. We've seen that on Twitter too, but it also leads to, I think, burnout by people who want to engage in the dialogue, but realize that you go in, you might come out a person that you don't like seeing yourself in the mirror based on what you have to do to get ahead or what you have to do to get a point across. Just having good content might not be enough, isn't enough on Twitter, right? You have to also, or X, right? You have to be mean to in a way.
Yeah. Ultimately, that's why I stepped away from the platform and stopped trying to go viral in the kind of Twitter historian space, the history space in Twitter, because oftentimes I found that it really incentivizes bad behavior. It incentivizes being mean. It incentivizes being going out of your way to not just defeat somebody else. It makes it kind of a victory versus defeat kind of mentality. And doing good history, oftentimes in that space, you don't have enough space to properly contextualize things, to fully go into detail on things, and it creates a lot of bad habit, and it really changed and warped certainly the way that I was interacting with others online, and I really ended up disliking the way that it changed the way I was thinking about the world, not just history, but also about politics, because everyone's a pundit, and it makes it into just a really toxic, negative environment that doesn't necessarily have a basis in the real world.
May I give one follow-up example of that?
Yeah.
This not about like the current political vortex, but the president of the AHA, I think 2 years ago, posted this piece in Perspectives on History about presentism, and I disagreed with some of the pieces in there, and I fell into the vortex of attacking him on Twitter, and it took a couple hours, and just seeing it not die down, and time started was getting ready to report on it, and I felt this deep guilt all of a sudden that I was part of this mob that was out to just tear down this person's life and his reputation. And I ended up seeing him and saying, like, look, I don't think you know what it's like to work at a public history site. That's my criticism of this, but I don't think you deserve to be going through what you're going through on here. And then, there was a response and all that. And a few months later, because he was publishing these monthly articles, he publishes a story about his son passing away, ending his life or overdose or something like this. It was very, very, very sad, very, very terrible. And there was not a bleep on Twitter about it. So there's all this energy into attacking someone who said, maybe be cautious about what you're showing about the profession when you are going for the biggest op-ed you can. But there was no empathy across those professional lines either, and I thought that was really sad. And that was when I got off actively on X or Twitter.
Yeah, and it's interesting too. I think kind of transitioning to my next question here. With the platform, with X, Twitter, whatever we're calling it these days, as that has kind of fractured, as social media in general has fractured, we've seen that concept. I've certainly, maybe it's just I'm not in the space, but definitely see less of that spillover of Twitter pylons making their way over into more traditional media. I don't know if If you've seen any of that, but that AHA one is one of the last really big ones that I kind of recall.
Yeah, you might be right. Yeah, it might be more fractured than it was. The director of Civil War Trails, Drew Gruber, had shared recently some findings from social media research showing that that there's maybe fatigue people using social media, and so maybe that time is winding down, and maybe it's time to kind of reassess what what ways we're engaging digitally with public audiences, and maybe digital isn't the end all be all that it seemed like it was coming 5 or 10 years, and especially during COVID.
Yeah, with this kind of transitional moment for History Online, and with going back to this article that kind of centering around the conversation, which I haven't mentioned, but we will put a link to that into the show notes so you can go and read that for yourself, see what we're discussing here. But I'm curious for your take, Evan. Where do you see public historians fitting into these national conversations?
So, I think I hesitate to question what is public history, what isn't public history. But when I hear that question, my mind never immediately goes there, and I actually question whether whether being on Twitter or really any sort of whether the social media world is how you, as a practicing historian, would define public history. I mean, is it engage? Is it audience building? Sure. Is the historical skills that you're cultivating and in college and beyond, are those the skills you're using in those settings? And do the especially the kind of the negative stuff we're talking about. In my observations, and please correct me if I'm wrong, it seems like the main culprits here are professors or people who are largely in these insulated roles, who are taking on these kind of larger than life, larger than profession kind of personalities on Twitter. I generally don't see people who work day in and day out on National Register nominations or Section 106 review getting engaged in these. Now, maybe they're doing it under different names, but maybe there's so from my observation, at museums, at historic sites, conversations like these are much more moderate and much more based around trying to find common ground and trying to have dialogue rather than trying to shut the other side down. And so I don't know. I don't know if I've answered your question, but if you feel free to tell me what you think that public historians can or should be doing in these situations.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point. This is a conversation that I had just last week with Cody Aish at the Seminary Ridge Museum in Gettysburg. We were talking kind of about, what role do public historians at a place like Seminary Ridge Museum, a Civil War focused history site, where these conversations about, who we are as a country and how that era impacts, the aftermath of American history since then. And it, you touched on this. It's like, about finding common ground with people. This is what we came back to, because ultimately, and in my past working at the Civil War Medicine Museum here in Frederick, we had to face, visitors, real life people with all manner of different interpretations, different understandings, coming from different physical places, coming from different education levels. And you were always having to go and meet people where they were. And, you're not going to convince everybody that your interpretation of any historical moment or event is absolutely correct. What you can do is get a conversation going, get people thinking about something in a way maybe they didn't before. And that is really the crux of, working at a museum historic site. When you're working face to face with the public, that's the way, that's the conversations you're going to have by and large. And it's even in a digital environment, even in the Facebook comment section, which was quite ugly sometimes at the Civil War Medicine Museum. Oftentimes those were real visitors who would come in and refer back to the comments. You could be facing any of those people at any given time. And that is something from I've never worked on the kind of academic side or been in that space, but there might be a little bit of a distance there between, an audience, a national audience on Twitter, where you're never really going to likely come face to face with the people you're trying to shut down or, dunking on Twitter. So I think, I would agree, I think with your observations there. Do you want to say anything more about kind of interpersonal skills when it comes to working on site in public history?
Well, so I'm thinking about your answer to that. I'm thinking that students often don't talk back. I often wish they would talk back a lot more than they do, but there is such a kind of a classroom deference, even in a discussion-based class like a graduate seminar. I find that what I say usually carries a lot of weight, and that might be the part of the class is when you have people who are used to kind of this depth. For your PhD doesn't mean anything online. You're going to get someone saying, "Well, why you're not a physician? Why do you have that?" Right? So, but also, your point about Facebook comments and all this, and it reminds me of that I found that at Andersonville, and I only worked there for 6 months, but it was in 2015. It was tense. It was very tense. And at a place like Andersonville, where 13,000 U.S. soldiers died for want of wholesome food and water, shelter, it was a very difficult place to talk about tough history. And I found that escalation did work, and that there were interpretive and maybe just like human interpersonal victories to be had in the process of de-escalation. So standing there at the prison site and someone says, "What about Elmira?" Right? What about the prison camp in Elmira, New York, where my great-great-granddaddy died in or suffered through the fall of 1864? And, that is not the place. You can't win that argument. You can't win it online. You can't win it when it's 96 degrees out in under the Georgia sun. But in the process of saying something along the lines of, "This is my go-to answer," I'm happy to have a conversation with you about the push-pull of the prisoner of war system, the politics of it, in depth, as much depth as you want. I would just ask that in this space where the U.S. soldiers were 45,000 U.S. soldiers were imprisoned, and 13,000 of those U.S. soldiers did not go home, that we for the moment focus on these soldiers. And that seemed to work, right? There's kind of that appeal to, shared values about military service or the country, and that served to give enough of, and I guess, sympathy to the question that was being asked, without wasting too much time on it, or worse, pushing back too hard and perhaps losing the rest of my audience, the rest of my visitors along the way, who had never heard of Elmira and who were just taking an educational break on the way back from Disneyland and were not really sure what they got into, right?
Yeah.
There's I think that's what I think. I think you're right with it. Interpersonal skills matter a whole lot.
Another element here, and I think this has been a push of ours on this podcast to kind of talk about this, about the careers, the career paths of those that work in public history. And we've only really started this. We're doing a series, Making a Public Historian. It's going to kind of go around to a couple of, course, museums, historic sites, but you mentioned, Section 106 and historic preservation. And that's something we really want to get to is, all of the variety of different ways that you know history is approached in this way. That there are many different paths to working in public history. But I'm curious, because I think ultimately we want this to be of use to potential future public historians who might be interested in entering into a career path that is going to send them in this direction. I'm really curious, about how you, in your role as a professor, speak with future public historians about how to address these thorny issues, some of which we've discussed today, and many others, when they crop up in real life, at whether it's at a historic site or whether doing historic preservation. Or I'm curious how you approach those conversations with those future public historians.
Well, I'm in the process of crafting a syllabus about this right now, so I'm maybe too much in my own mind about this question. But I guess in short, public history is it's not a backup plan. It's not simplified academic history. It's tough. It's hard. It requires the research and the communication skills of academic history, but as a minimum requirement. And it also, as we've touched on, requires a great deal of empathy to people of different backgrounds and ages and strengths. And college teachers, we might be coming around to this in the classroom. We think about, exception of some states getting rid of these. You have to have it craft a diversity statement for how are you going to discuss different viewpoints or different backgrounds in your class. But public historians have had to be far ahead of this in terms of collegiality. I mean, who is a peer in public history is much wider than who is a peer in academic, because it might be a city planner. It might be a Main Street director who's never heard the term public history but should have. It might be, it might be just someone who is retired, who is incredibly knowledgeable about this city block, and is going to know when you mess up, and you're gonna want forgiveness when you do that. So you're going to want to work with them, and when they haven't read all the books you've had. So don't be the person who has to be the smartest person in the room. Be careful in, your interactions, especially at historic sites and museums, that you're not the person who ruined the family outing, a snarky comment, or a condescending comment, ruins, worse, a kid's interest in history. You can be provocative. You can do the whole, Freeman Tilden principles of interpretation, all that stuff about connecting something in there, or interpretation is provocative and all that. You can do all of that while being while not being cruel, and that's I think that's a very difficult skill to teach. I don't know. I'm still working on how that should come across in the classroom, but maybe one way it comes across is by trying to model that in at least some of your work. And look, I can be critical of a National Park Service or of a book that I think gets something wrong, but I do very much try to keep those totalizing statements in check.
Excellent. Well, I think your students, it sounds like, are going to be in for a treat in hearing this and hearing your perspectives. I want to thank you so much for sharing, your thoughts on kind of where we are, where we might be going, where we've been in terms of public history and online conversations. Before I let you go, Evan, I just wanted to hear a little bit. Very curious about some of the projects you have kind of going on your side of things. So what are you working on these days?
So the oldest cemetery in Kalamazoo, Michigan, was turned into a park in the 1880s. They buried the headstones but before they did that, they did this very detailed map of the cemetery and took down all the grave inscriptions. And this is all there. This is because people love local history, and they've been, they preserved this record. Well, I'm working on this to create an interactive map, and then hopefully with students to build out a website that tells some of the early history of the city of Kalamazoo through the stories of people in the cemetery, but also the opening and the closing of that cemetery from the 1830s to the Civil War era. That's my public history local work. That's my laboratory, my public history lab. But then I'm also writing a book on Rosalie Ingram, who was a widowed mother of 12 sentenced to death with two of her children, what became nationally known as self-defense slang of a neighboring sharecropper. This is in the 1940s. And it's a century after what my earlier projects were on. But I came to this project when I was living in Georgia. I've carried it with me up to Michigan. I think it's an undertold story about race, gender, self-defense, justice in the mid-century South. And so I'm working maybe a little slower than I'd like to, but working on a book on that.
Excellent. Sounds wonderful. Looking forward to seeing these out in the world in the months and years to come. I want to say too, I have an appreciation for kind of what you do. To dig in really deep to some local topics and finding that history where you were at, and working to share those stories, because that's what I find myself most passionate about as well, sharing the stories of places where I grew up in Pennsylvania. It's those digging really deep. It's kind of where you find the stories of the real American stories that, of people whose lives may not necessarily have made it into the history books before, but it's a way of telling their stories. So really, really appreciate the work that you do.
Thank you. That's very nice to hear. And thanks again for inviting me on.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for coming on. And I have a feeling we'll probably talk again at some point, because this was a really fun conversation. And I think one that was, could lead us in lots of different directions in the future. We could talk about kind of similar things in the field of public history. So thank you so much, Evan.
My pleasure.
And another huge thank you to Evan for joining us for that fascinating discussion. I'm really curious, Justin, what did you think about that conversation?
Yeah, so I got to be a fly on the wall and be a listener just like everybody else and have my popcorn. And it was just a fantastic conversation. I thought Evan's most, I don't know, the point that I took away the most is he had a quote where, saying public history is not a backup plan. It's tough, it's hard, it requires hard study just as much as academia, and then you've got to go talk about it, right? So it's very much more, it's harder to interact because you really have to know your stuff. Whereas, for academia, you can write, you can stew on it, you can kind of look at every sentence and every single word in that sentence and make it perfect. Nature of public history, you're going to be talking about it and things are going to come out. You don't have that same type of reflection before you publish your work. You're publishing your work is you doing your tour, or you talking with the public, or you stepping out into public discourse. So I thought that was a very wise and interesting thing to say, because the role of the historian, and he also talks about this too, is there's no license to practice history. There's no license that you have to pass. There's no bar exam or med school, whatever you need to pass. Anybody can practice history. And I think that was one thing that was also very interesting, because in the public history field, he talked about who are the peers for a public historian? When it's Jake, I mean, the field that you work in, I'm sure you see that every day. If you could speak more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I somebody that he mentions, Evan mentions, a good friend of mine, Drew Gruber with Civil War Trails, organization that kind of straddles the line between history and heritage tourism, travel related to history, Main Street managers, historic preservationists. Those are all people that I work, even though I work in the tourism industry. I'm working alongside people that work with history every day, and I'm fortunate to be able to work alongside them. So public history is it's a pretty wide range of different kinds of professions that you could call practicing public history.
Yeah, and I think that what's awesome about that too is that, I mean, you can think, Jake, we talked about this on one of our excursions, is would they identify themselves as doing public history? And I don't think that they would for a lot of them. I mean, Drew Gruber, yes, it's a war trail, it's just the nature of it, but a Main Street manager, or, someone doing, someone who is a historian, I'm using air quotes here, of their neighborhood, just because they've lived there for 50 and 60 years. They know all the stories. They know how the neighborhood has evolved over years, right? I don't think if you would tell them, hey, are you doing public history? They're going to say, well, I don't know what public history is. And no, this is my local history. This is what's around me. It's my local story even.
Yeah, it's so funny you say that, because I just very quick anecdote. Recently, had a chance to speak with a neighbor of ours here in the city of Frederick, and she's 99, going to be 100 coming up in a couple of months, and just an amazing, bright soul that we had the chance to talk to recently, and she leapt right into, I've lived in this neighborhood since the 1970s, and here's all these stories, and just launched into it. And yeah, she's sort of practicing, local history, public history, by telling us and sharing those stories of the neighborhood long before we ever arrived here in the city.
Yeah, and I just think that that's great. I'm glad that Evan talked about it, because it wasn't until he said it that it's a great thought experiment. Who is a peer for public historians? And I think that that's something, as a public historian, to always think about and maintain kind of that status of being inquisitive and curious, because I think that it would lead you down a lot of cool roles. And I love his comment, as a professor, he said, the students don't talk back. He wishes they would talk back more, right? When you get to these places and public history sites, he mentioned his story with Andersonville about conversation and the appeal to share values and interpersonal skills. I was telling Jake, as I was listening to that, I was typing down my notes, and the scene that I thought of is, when people are writing big theses or writing books, it's not like the diary from Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets that is answering every single question that you're writing. Once again, you can brood on it, you can think of it, you can make every sentence almost perfect before you send out your thoughts into the world, where public historians don't have that luxury. People immediately react to what you're saying, which is why I think his big thing on victories and de-escalation is wise, and a lot of people, I think, could take that to a lot of different career fields too, not just public history. But yeah, his story about Andersonville and focusing on I call it like whataboutism. What about Elmira? What about, if you think about anything in the Civil War, at least anything in history, someone's always going to say, well, what about this side? And they're kind of deflecting there. I thought he was very smart and very wise in saying, no, let's focus, since we're here, on the United States soldiers who died here at Chancellorsville, almost gosh, I'm going to say Chancellorsville, Andersonville. Sorry, just used to saying it. So yeah, I thought that was great. I thought that those were the biggest points I took away from the conversation. And those were the nuggets I thought were really good. And I once again, Evan, if you're listening, thank you so much for coming on. I enjoyed just sitting here listening to you and Jake talk, because it made me smarter, which is I hope the goal of a lot of the things that we talk about.
Yeah, this was a topic that has been at the kind of front of my mind for a long time, ever since we really started this show. Was really about kind of, that collision of where, public history and punditry have met online in the last decade. And, as I mentioned in that interview with Evan, talking about kind of my own aspiration to find popularity online through Twitter, and though realizing I'm not good at Twitter. I think it's something that, just having the opportunity to kind of reflect on that, several years after leaving Twitter/X, I found this conversation to be really satisfying to me. And I think Evan's just such a great mind, and, so many things that he said there, just like pulling out little bits and pieces, and just, that's really, really well said. I really am jealous of his students. I think they're in for a great experience to kind of delve into public history and how that can, really be a career path to build on. And it's something that's not the backup plan, as has been mentioned. It is a full on commitment to do it, but it is a very, very rewarding field.
Yeah, I'm really excited to see this syllabus once it's done, Evan. If you could send it our way, because I just for personal development, very excited about reading it.
All right. So now it's time for a postscript. This is a section of the show where we share something from the last week that's left an impression on us that we want to share. It could be a book, an article, a movie, or an experience. It's something that we want to remember from our last week. I think this is of all of the postscripts that we've done, definitely the most somber. This has been a difficult week in our field. Justin and I and many of our friends and colleagues work in the field of Civil War history and public history related to Civil War historic sites and museums. And we lost a real light in the field, someone who was incredibly influential on the lives and careers of many of the public historians that we associate with, that we are friends with, and here in the Mid-Atlantic region, especially with Civil War sites. And that is Dr. Pete Carmichael, passed away this past weekend at the age of 58. And just somebody who, I was remarking today at work, just looking at my Facebook feed over the last several days, has been almost every post has been a memorial to Dr. Carmichael, remembrances, tributes, a lot of thank yous for his role in shaping the careers of many public historians at historic sites and museums, professors, many people in the history field, some retired, some just starting their careers, some still in school, and a true tribute to the influences of Dr. Carmichael, that he was able to have an impact on so many people through his work with the National Park Service, through his academic teachings, but especially through his role as the head of the Civil War Institute at Gettysburg College. So we just wanted to take a quick moment. Our postscripts today are going to be kind of some little remembrances that we have of Dr. Carmichael. So I'll start over with you, Justin.
Yeah, I from all the things that have been poured forward this week, I'm sad that I did not get to know him more, because it seems he was truly one of the leaders for not just public history field, but all around, just a good person. And I was an incoming freshman at WVU. Dr. Carmichael, before his current poster, most recent post at Gettysburg College, worked at West Virginia University. And I can't remember if it was my incoming freshman year that he moved to Gettysburg, or within a couple years. And I remember getting to the history department, declaring my major as history. And when I talked with the faculty that were there, they said, "Oh, you got to make sure you talk to Pete Carmichael at Gettysburg College. He is truly one of the best." And they handed me his email information. I sent him a couple emails, and I remember him responding. I couldn't tell you, what I asked or really what the content of the emails were about. There's not some great pontification. I think something that not lost in all of it, though, is that he took the time to respond to me, even though I was no longer a student at the college that he currently was employed by. But yet still, I think, sacrificed his time, even if it was 5 minutes, to send me a quick note on, Civil War history and the public history field, and giving that encouragement. So I was unfortunately not able to know him more, but a lot of the people I care about know him and can't say nothing but good things about him. So I truly am hurting for my friends this week, and wish that, we find comfort in that. So Jake, I'll pass it to you.
Yeah, it's funny. It's sort of like, you talk about him leaving WVU. My first interaction with Pete was in 2010. I was one of the high school scholarship students that got to go to the Civil War Institute summer conference at Gettysburg College. And I was there in the summer of 2010. It was a focus. The theme was, they still did themes back then, was about the election of 1860. And I can remember that whole week being just amazing, kind of my introduction to Civil War history as a profession, as a potential career path, and really kind of early introduction to public history. That summer was the summer that Pete was announced as the incoming head of Civil War Institute. And so I remember a little bit. I remember his huge smile from that. We joked, call him Smiling Pete, the high school scholarship students, because he was just so excited to be there. And he was introduced while we were there at the summer conference. I went to Hood College in Frederick, so just down the road from Gettysburg. Didn't interact with him at all, really, at my time at Hood. But shortly after graduating from Hood College and spending time in the National Park Service for a summer, I went to work at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine and had numerous opportunities to work with Pete's students at Gettysburg College, whether it was coming up to speak to the class about public history, to talk about Civil War medicine, and then did have kind of some of the true joys of my work as a public historian. We're having the opportunity to go and participate as kind of a summer faculty at the Civil War Institute, where I was as a scholarship student in high school in 2010. To come back and to be able to speak on the main stage at CWI and to have that opportunity through Pete and through Ashley Lusky, who I'm really feeling for, as well as everyone at Gettysburg College that worked with Pete. And those were some of my high points in my career as a public historian, was to return to CWI and to spend time with all of the amazing people, whether they be historians, the general public, students there. Pete and his team there really built an amazing place that is so influential on so many public historians. It really, it's hard to imagine our field and public history, Civil War history without Pete. It's really hard to imagine that. And I'm really feeling for, many people knew Pete and his family far better than I. I'm really feeling for Pete's family and for those who were his closest friends. He was a great friend, an amazing advocate, and just a friend, I would say, in general. So we wanted to dedicate this episode to Dr. Carmichael, for all the current and future public historians who you have influenced during your life and career. We truly, truly thank you. And that's all for this episode of Public History with Jake and Justin. And we'll talk to you again soon.